Abbey Road is one of the greatest albums of the late 20th century. It's a fantastic frozen moment in the lives of the most famous band of all time, telling a magnificent and emotional story through its operatic proceedings. Sometimes a Spotify playlist I put on will play just one song, and I immediately have to stop it and listen to the whole album from start to finish. There is no other correct way to experience Abbey Road than this. But what stands out the most about the album is the cover, which is so simplistic yet so unforgettable. Every part seems perfectly in place, as if changing one thing would be defacing a piece of priceless art, planned as carefully as if it had been painted by hand. What's funny is that the cover was forged entirely by accident. We actually have several of the other photos taken that day, and what we see in that roll is the four Beatles continuously crossing the road in snapshots that feel totally wrong and absolutely not worthy of an album cover, until finally, the perfect image appears totally out of the blue. But at the time, no one really knew this. For many decades, Beatle fans around the world saw this image as if it were an artifact from the Da Vinci Code. It needed to be analyzed and understood. Clues needed to be discovered and broken down to uncover what it was really all meant to mean. And those fans that searched for meaning found something that would shock the world.
What the fuck?
Yes, on the cover of Abbey Road, Paul McCartney isn't wearing shoes. When this was first uncovered shortly after the album's release, conspiracy theorists and college stoners across the world agreed that this could only mean one thing. In 1966, the real Paul McCartney died in a car accident. The remaining three Beatles, possibly with the assistance from the British government, chose to cover up his death and seek a lookalike replacement to fill his place. The replacement chosen, whose name was either William Campbell or William Shears, filled in the dead Beatles spot perfectly, and in the remaining 3 years, the group would hide clues in their album seeking to reveal the truth about what had really happened. Now, I hate to burst anyone's bubble here, but none of this is actually true. Paul McCartney is still alive, he still makes albums, and in the most horrific revelation of all, he still wears shoes. But for many years after the Beatles broke up, and again after the invention of the internet, many people believed that he was, in fact, dead as a doornail. To this day, fringe eccentrics are still trying to prove that all of this is true, many releasing tell-all books and documentaries trying to reveal the Beatles' darkest secret. Today I would like to take a deep dive into the Paul is dead phenomenon, partially because I am very much a Beatle enthusiast and I so rarely get to talk about it on this channel, but also because I believe Paul is dead to be one of the first prototype conspiracy theories. In some weird way, if we understand the mentality of Paul is dead, how it gained traction and why its followers still justify it to this day, the general spread of misinformation in a modern age will make a bit more sense. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let me take you down, because I'm going to, on a tragical history tour of fiction and fools, lies and intrigue. Come along for the ride. We're dying to take you away. As we've established, in the early 1970s, Beatle fans across the world began to study the imagery of Beatle content, looking for deeper meaning and understanding of the creator's intentions. And very quickly, one strange element started to materialize across most of the final albums, a strange separation between Paul and the rest of the band. On the cover of Abbey Road, not only is Paul not wearing shoes, but he's also out of step with the rest of the group. In the Magical Mystery Tour, all of the Beatles are illustrated wearing red carnations, except for Paul, who's wearing one that is black. And most infamously, on the back cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul has his back turned to the camera, as if he is hiding something. And let's talk more about that album for a quick second. Once again, this is among the most iconic album art of all time. And once again, its intense detail leads one to believe that there is something hidden behind all of the images. The sea of faces looking over the scene, the garden of flowers almost acting as a memorial, and the mix of the band's past and present both being at the scene. But the greatest discovery of all came when someone decided to hold a mirror up to just below the three main members of the band, revealing what seems to be a secret message. 119. He die, with an arrow pointing directly to Paul.
Oh shit, buddy, I gotta dig a little deeper.
119 is interpreted to be the date of death, aka 11/9, the 9th of November. On the back cover, George glares down to the reader and points his finger knowingly to a specific lyric.
Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins.
And it just happens that November the 9th, 1966, was a Wednesday, meaning that this is Paul's tombstone, and 5 o'clock was the moment he died. After this, the story really started to fall into place. On the early hours of Wednesday, November the 9th, 1966, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr got into a vicious fight, which ended with McCartney storming out of the studio and driving off in his Austin Healey. On his way, he met a young woman named Rita, who needed a ride home, and found himself happy to oblige. As it's been said, they nearly made it. In a song some years later, John recounted exactly what happened that night.
He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. No one was really sure if he was from the house of Paul. The lyric is actually Lords, but if you have bad headphones, it sounds like Paul.
Once one realizes that this was Paul's ultimate fate, the imagery of many Beatle albums seems much more sinister. Again, on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a doll sits to the right side of the frame. To its right sits a driving glove, covered in blood. And on its knee, in a detail so small that you could miss it every time you looked, a small toy car sits. The inside of the car is red, painted with blood. Hyper-realistic blood. Meanwhile, on the compilation album A Collection of Beatle Oldies, which canonically would have been the first album made after Paul's death, a mysterious, unidentified Beatle lays across a collage of several landscapes. At the top of the cover, a car drives on a long and winding road, heading directly for Paul's head. After the fight, Ringo had sat anxiously waiting for Paul to return, only to ultimately learn of his true fate shortly thereafter.
I listen for your footsteps coming up the drive. Listen for your footsteps, but they don't arrive. I'm sorry that I doubted you. I was so unfair. You were in a car crash, and you lost your hair.
After Paul's sudden death, his band members were horrified by their loss, and John himself was given the task of burying the body on a hill at Liverpool's abandoned Strawberry Fields Cemetery. They were sworn to secrecy, as the government assisted them in replacing Paul with a near lookalike, who began the difficult task of finding acceptance in the group. But despite this, John couldn't help but plant clues hinting to the truth of what happened that night in November 1966. When listening to the end of the song I'm So Tired, one can hear what seems to be John muttering utter gibberish, but when playing the album in reverse, the song Strawberry Fields features at its end a reprise which is sort of random and serves no real purpose, unless one stops to listen for John's voice, which is clearly an admission of guilt. But the most famous out of all the clues can be found by playing the infamous number 9 in reverse, changing the start of the song to a cryptic end. But if Paul McCartney was dead, as it certainly seems to have been the case, then who was the man who continued to live his life? Well, around the same time, a Canadian man named William Shears Campbell is said to have existed before he suddenly went missing and was never heard from again. This new Paul, Fall, as he has been called, was none other than Campbell with a little bit of surgery, by his own admission through his own music.
Love by you. Show my gratitude. Gratitude.
Okay, now let's listen to that backwards.
Push this out. Push this out. Push this out.
This is the only known photograph of William Campbell before his plastic surgery, a series of operations he undertook to look more like the real Paul McCartney. But it wouldn't be entirely successful, as many have pointed out over the years. Paul and Fall just don't look alike. They have different ears, they seem to be different heights, and many say that Paul's actual eye color changed from brown to green. John in particular did not get along very well with the new fake Paul, and introduced to 2 of his albums the character of the Walrus, a reference to a Lewis Carroll character most known for being an imposter. John made it explicitly clear in Glass Onion who he intended the Walrus to be.
I told you about the walrus and me, man. You know we're as close as can be, man. Well, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul.
Each album cover at this point represents some aspect of the hidden story. Abbey Road is a funeral procession. John is dressed in white, as he is the priest. Ringo is the undertaker, ready to prepare the body for burial. George is dressed as a lowly gravedigger, and will be the last to leave. And Paul, walking without shoes in the proper burial style, is the corpse. In the back of the scene, a Beatle sits alone, representing the true Paul who had been lost, with a license plate that reads 28 if. If Paul had been alive, he would have been just over 28 at this time. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is an illustration of Paul's secret funeral, with mourners gathered to lay Paul to rest. And while the original cover of Yesterday and Today featured a rather innocent image of the Beatles having just murdered a series of babies, the more sinister cover, which actually went to press, clearly depicted Paul separated from the rest of the Beatles in what looks to be a metaphorical coffin. Once you've learned to see the Beatle discography like this, these clues can be found almost anywhere. In the El Submarine movie, during the first scene in the submarine, this shot shows all of the Beatles together, with an additional 5th figure, that being Paul duplicated onto a screen. There are 2 Pauls, one of them is fake. In the film, The Ruddles' All You Need Is Cash, Eric Idle plays 2 characters. One is a parody of Paul, and one is a reporter, who while crossing Abbey Road at the end of the film is killed by a car in the exact position that Paul would be on the cover of the album, indicating that Paul is dead. And the biggest piece of evidence? In 1993, Fall released a live album entitled Paul is Live, which is exactly what he would do if he was actually dead, and he didn't want us to catch on to the fact that he wasn't alive! Now, as we've discussed, everything here is hogwash. None of it is true, and frankly, it's much too cartoony to really be believable, and yet it captivated so many, and I wonder if even some of you in the audience now are expecting there to be some kernel of truth to all this. Maybe the quartet really did hide all these clues, inventing this theory for fun and trying to confuse people. Maybe the clues were there, but people weren't really connecting the dots in the right way, and the actual conclusion wasn't what people thought it was. Well, let's discover the truth together, as we move on towards... This video is going to be really awkward when Paul McCartney dies for real. At this point, it might seem a little bizarre that I've chosen this topic for a full essay, when it seems like something totally innocuous and absolutely innocent. Some people in the 70s thought that Paul McCartney had been replaced by a lookalike. That's sort of interesting, but it doesn't seem to pertain a lot to our modern world outside of it just being a bit of history. Well, if you feel that way, I think you're wrong. The Paul is dead theory happens to be one of the first widespread conspiracy theories or hoaxes which was brought about by a large amount of people. Today it's either treated like a joke or something totally non-literal, but at the time a considerable amount of people bought into this, and it's for the exact same reason that people buy into our current conspiracy theories. Paul is dead is basically harmless, but by understanding it fully, we can also uproot misinformation in general, and why it can be so unbelievably unstoppable. One of my favorite books of all time is called Abominable Science, which is a sociological and scientific study of something which is not that scientific, that being cryptozoology. Now, for those who don't know, while zoology is the study of animals which exist and there is substantial evidence of, cryptozoology is the study of animals for which there is basically no extraordinary evidence of, but people still believe in for one reason or another. For instance, Bigfoot, Nessie, Mothman, and so on and so forth. Mythical beings who have been known in the general culture for over 50 years, yet we have no evidence of. No corpses, no shed fur, no scat, or really anything of substantial value. Just blurry photos and first-hand accounts that have no consistency from one person to the next. People in the cryptozoological community have long lamented that scientists and regular zoologists have refused to take them or their evidence seriously. But what's actually at play is a difference of approach between these two groups. Zoologists gather evidence, they find proof, and then they come to conclusions. Cryptozoologists choose a specific conclusion and then hunt for evidence, any evidence, that they are the people who are in the right. Because of this, zoologists have a high standard for proof, and cryptozoologists do not. A cryptozoologist will look at a grainy photo of a hairy creature and will say, look, that has to be evidence that I'm right about Bigfoot. And a zoologist will then say, I'm pretty sure that's famous YouTuber Quentin Reviews. This is a constant across most hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and general non-truths. There's a YouTuber named Innuendo Studios who has a series called Why Are You So Angry?, which is dedicated to analyzing the mentality of online hate mobs. And in said series, he uses the metaphor of a table. A table, he argues, needs to be based on a foundation in order to be sturdy. It needs legs to support it. It needs legs to be defined as a table. Sometimes it turns out that this intellectual foundation is false, that these legs aren't actually there at all. But when people are emotionally invested in believing in a narrative, in being able to say that this is a table and not just a plank of baseless nothing, they construct downward, inventing unsubstantiated support for their theory, which will always be there because they will it to be.
It doesn't matter if these arguments are contradictory, because they're interchangeable. Disprove one and it'll be swapped with another. This is how a conspiracy theory works, a theory supported by theories, where the value of a theory is not does it hold up to scrutiny, but does it lead to the pre-chosen conclusion.
One example I always fall back to is the grassy knoll JFK assassination theory. People have long theorized that Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have acted alone, based almost entirely on misunderstood pseudoscience, and many have thus interjected that there must have been another shooter somewhere else. Case in point, at the grassy knoll. Those looking into this theory studied an image from the assassination, and found deep in the grain of the image what they believed to be a man, wearing sunglasses and a badge, partially hidden behind what looks to be discharge from a gun. This is not actually in the photo. It's just noise and grain and random shapes caused by gaps between tree branches in a low-quality copy of low-quality film. This badge man has never been documented in any other photos or film from the same time, and studies at the actual knoll have found that in order for this photo to be real, he would have to be about 2 feet tall. A few years after this theory gained steam, a documentary crew trying to give credence to the conspiracy theorists were given testimony from an alleged eyewitness, who claimed that he was the man at the grassy knoll, and that he saw 2 other men who shot Kennedy, and that those 2 men then got away. Why he waited several decades to tell anyone about this is anyone's guess. But those in charge of the documentary then turned around, looked at the grassy knoll photograph again, and then found and presented 2 brand new figures just to prove that this man's claims were correct.
This appears to be a person in a hard hat and a white t-shirt. The lighting on him is entirely consistent with the lighting on Badgeman. In other words, there's a highlight on the construction helmet.
When someone was expected to be at the grassy knoll, believers found that person. But the moment that there were supposed to be 3 people at the grassy knoll, they found those extra 2 people sitting to the side. They were told a supposed fact. They became invested in it being true, and then they looked for any evidence, regardless of merit, which would prove their investment worthwhile. Now, up to this point, most of the theories we've talked about have been rather frivolous and fun, covering topics like if famous rock stars were replaced by the British government, or if the moon landing happened and crap like that. But the modern conspiracy tall tale, which we know to exist as a phenomenon today, can be a lot more malicious and furthermore dangerous. At this point, I am briefly going to talk about mass shootings, as well as 9/11 conspiracies. If either of those things are personal triggers for you, I suggest moving the video forward to this time code. I want to apologize, it's just that when talking about conspiracies, these things just naturally happen to come up. Are we good? Okay. Alex Jones clip in 5, 4, 3, 2.
They have staged events before, but then you learn the school had been closed and reopened, and you got video of the kids going in circles in and out of the building, and they don't call the rescue choppers for 2 hours, and then they tear the building down and seal it, and they get caught using blue screens, and a email by Bloomberg comes out in a lawsuit where he's telling his people, get ready in the next 24 hours to capitalize on a shooting. So Sandy Hook is a synthetic, completely fake, with actors, in my view, manufactured. I couldn't believe it at first.
Perhaps the most abhorrent yet popular of modern conspiracy theories is that numerous tragedies, specifically shootings, have all been false flag productions created by the US government, usually under the justification of wanting gun control. Because as we all know, when the American government enacts conspiracies to orchestrate secret plots, they're always doing it to help the left. There's two things that are scary about those who believe in theories like this. The first is that there are victims to these falsehoods being spread around, specifically the survivors of these tragedies, who are often harassed by believers with threats of violence based on the fact that many seriously don't believe them to be real human beings.
This is supposed to be a man of God, but yet he's told the whole world that 26 people died in his church when nobody died. He's a liar.
Comment you just made, knowing my 14-year-old daughter's laying...
You're a liar, Frank. You're a filthy liar, Frank.
People who have come close to dying at the hands of madmen have to fear for their lives from more madmen because people like Alex Jones tell their audiences blatant lies. And the other factor is that there is no real way to dissuade most of these mobs. They were never convinced by any real tangible evidence. They just chose to believe in something on the fly, and so if you disprove something they say, they'll just fall back on another claim, and that'll continue forever and ever and ever. This is also something that's very common with 9/11 conspiracy theorists. Whenever truthers are actively shown that any tenet of their beliefs are completely wrong, instead of taking in this information for even 1 second to consider, they tend to immediately pivot and replace that load-bearing theory with a completely new one. And from their perspective, doing anything but this would mean that they've been actively wasting their lives. This is a table. I've been saying for years that it's a table. If it turns out that it's not a table, I look like a massive idiot. So it has to be a table. And jumping back to the lighter topic of our video, this is exactly the basis for where Paul is Dead believers pull their perspective. They choose to believe something is true, and so they look for any evidence that it might be true, and of course they find it, because why wouldn't they? The persuasive power of implication comes through the most clearly during the supposed backmasking messages that believers have found, playing the records in reverse, which are essentially entirely gibberish. But when you take relative gibberish and add captions to them, your mind sort of fills in the gaps, and you automatically believe whatever you've been told. For instance, at the end of Strawberry Fields, when John is supposed to be saying, "I buried Paul," well, the anthology release of early takes of the song revealed that he was in fact saying, That's right, he wasn't saying, "I bury Paul," he was saying, "Sing it with me now." There's literally a sea of evidence for Paul is Dead that is so massive that I could sit here for hours debunking all of it, telling you all about how Paul's eyes were dark with a hint of green and it just only shows up in good lighting, and how the theoretical drum tombstone uses the American system for dates instead of the British, and 1,000 other things, and at the end of the day it would still be possible for believers to find evidence that I hadn't touched yet. Instead, I want to discuss one anecdote of the theory which I feel totally represents exactly how silly it is. Around the time that John Lennon was working on Sgt. Pepper, he had begun to hear whispers that teachers, desperate to get their students interested in projects, had begun assigning them homework analyzing the lyrics written under the Lennon-McCartney label. Much like Frost and Shakespeare beforehand, what was being taught often had nothing to do with what Paul or John had actually intended. This inspired him to write I Am the Walrus, which is filled with lyrics which make no sense on purpose and were just trying to confuse people trying to find meaning in his music. But people did find meaning despite him trying to make it impossible, believing that the walrus was somehow important to who John was, and that it represented some deeper aspect of his personality or his view on the world. And so, John wrote Glass Onion, a song entirely dedicated to referencing old songs in a way which makes absolutely no sense. And that's where we get our famous line,
"The walrus was Paul."
Again, none of this makes any sense, and it's not intended to. These two songs were intended to be the ultimate misdirection made entirely out of spite, and it worked so well that people were somehow convinced that the Beatles covered up a man's death. In fact, John was the only Beatle who seemed to think that the legend was all that amusing, and he went out of his way to reference it in his own music when he made a diss track about the real Paul in 1971. Just so we're on the same page, if Paul McCartney was replaced, and this fall figure is a completely different man, he still made the best music the band ever did. In the early 1970s, people thought Paul McCartney was dead. It was a theory which made no sense, which blew up globally. And the question is, why? I have a theory. 1970 was a rough year for music fans. The Beatles were officially over. And to many, this was a breakup that they would never rebound from. Paul McCartney fell into a deep depression and became extremely secluded, living on his family's farm and barely doing public appearances, and generally all of the Beatles felt very distant. Eventually, they all became quite friendly and flirted with the idea of eventually making music again, but that all changed when John was murdered in late 1980. John left a few unfinished demos sitting around, which he mysteriously addressed to Paul, and years later the three remaining members finished some of those songs. But with that romanticism aside, after 1969, the Beatles were dead. And more than anything else, Paul is Dead gave grieving fans the chance to enjoy songs from a whole new perspective. Oh, you thought Revolution 9 was trippy forwards? Wait till you hear it backwards. Now it's an experimental piece of erotic mourning as John Lennon admits his sexual infatuation with his dead best friend. Oh, turn me on, dead man, turn me on.
No, actually, we're just good friends.
And while the presence of people who unironically believed in the theory is absolutely worth analyzing, I think Paul is Dead is mostly just a spooky urban legend that people like because it allows them to look at classical pieces of music in a whole new light. But at the same time, I hope this video to some extent has made you question how you consume information, and under what context you come to understand what is true and what is false. So often we let lies become truths entirely because of how we perceive them, and also because what we believe doesn't really tend to affect us most of the time. A wise writer once mused, "Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. Live with your eyes open. Question all that is worth questioning.